Vivian Parker stood at the glass wall of her penthouse, gazing down at the glittering skyline of Chicago. The city was alive beneath her, but in the penthouse, it was silent, just the hum of her thoughts echoing through the spacious, modern rooms. At 45, Vivian was an icon in the world of fashion, a self-made billionaire, her name synonymous with luxury and influence. Her brand, Parker Atelier, was a global empire, celebrated for its avant-garde designs and cutting-edge trends. Yet, despite her towering success, there was an emptiness that lingered in the air around her, an invisible weight that she carried silently. Her days were consumed with work, meetings with designers, negotiations with investors, fashion shows in Paris, Milan, and New York. But after the lights went out, after the applause faded, there was always that same silence. She had sacrificed everything for her career. Friendships, family, even her own peace of mind. Vivian could hardly remember the last time she had called her sister, who now lived on the West Coast. Her friends had long since drifted away, either unable to keep up with her demanding schedule or quietly bowing out as they watched her become a different person, colder, more distant. Success had made Vivian powerful, but it had also made her isolated. She turned away from the view and walked toward her marble kitchen, the click of her heels echoing against the walls. Her thoughts lingered on a conversation she'd had earlier with her assistant, Leah, about a charity event. Vivian had brushed off the idea, dismissing it as unnecessary. But as she poured herself a glass of wine, she realized she hadn't done anything unnecessary in years. Everything in her life was calculated, every decision, every move part of a larger strategy to maintain her empire. There was no room for kindness or frivolity in her world. Still, as she sipped her wine and stared into the empty rooms, she felt the nagging pull of something missing, something human. Vivian had everything, except anyone to share it with. That night, as the cold wind swept through Chicago, Vivian decided to take a drive through the city. She wanted to clear her mind, to escape the walls of her mansion that seemed to close in on her more and more each day. She instructed her driver to take the long route through downtown, past the shimmering stores and bustling nightlife that had once excited her. As they turned down a quieter street, something caught Vivian's eye. There, huddled against a storefront, was a figure, a young woman, barely more than a girl, dressed in ragged clothes, shivering in the cold. Her face was gaunt, her hair matted, and her eyes were wide, searching, like she was lost in a world that didn't see her. "Stop the car," Vivian commanded, her voice sharp. Her driver, used to her sudden orders, pulled over without question. Without thinking, Vivian stepped out of the warmth of her car and into the biting wind. She walked toward the girl, her heels clacking against the pavement. The girl looked up, startled, as Vivian crouched down beside her. Up close, Vivian could see just how fragile she was, thin, shaking, with a hollow look that spoke of hunger and fear. "Are you all right?" Vivian asked, her voice softer now, but the girl didn't answer. She only stared, as if unable to comprehend that someone like Vivian, someone so polished, so powerful, would speak to her. Vivian stood up, glancing around. The street was mostly empty, and the shops were closed. "Come with me," Vivian said, the words surprising even herself. She didn't know why she was doing this. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was pity. Or maybe, deep down, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness in this girl's eyes. The girl hesitated, but something in Vivian's voice compelled her to stand. Without another word, Vivian led her to the car, motioning for the driver to open the door. The girl slid into the seat cautiously, glancing around the luxurious interior like it was another world. Vivian got in after her and closed the door. "What's your name?" she asked as the car pulled away from the curb. The girl didn't answer at first. She stared out the window, as if trying to decide whether she could trust this stranger who had swept her out of the cold. After a long moment, she whispered, "Grace?" Vivian nodded, looking at the girl, at Grace. She didn't press for more. For now, it was enough that Grace was there, sitting beside her, in the warmth of the car. As they drove back to the mansion, a strange sense of calm washed over Vivian. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. Vivian's mansion was a fortress of modern architecture, towering glass windows and sleek lines nestled in the most exclusive part of Chicago. The car glided up the private driveway, past the high iron gates, and stopped at the grand entrance. The stone steps leading up to the house felt cold and unwelcoming as Grace stepped out, her worn sneakers barely making a sound on the polished surface. The mansion loomed above her, its sheer size overwhelming. Grace paused, her eyes wide, unsure whether to follow. It had been so long since anyone had offered her anything, let alone shelter. And this place seemed like a dream she would wake up from at any moment. Vivian noticed her hesitation. She softened her tone. "Come on," she said gently. But there was an edge to her voice, a commanding quality that allowed no refusal. Grace swallowed her anxiety and followed. The warmth of the house hit her as soon as she crossed the threshold. The lights were soft, and the air carried the faint scent of jasmine. The world inside these walls felt miles away from the cold, dangerous streets she'd been living on. It was like stepping into a different universe, one where time moved slower and everything was draped in quiet luxury. "Take a seat." Vivian gestured to the plush sofa in the grand living room. Grace looked unsure, like she might dirty the fabric just by sitting on it, but eventually, she lowered herself cautiously onto the edge, her body stiff. Vivian sat across from her, studying her. Up close, Grace's fragility was even more evident. Her hollow cheeks, the smudges of dirt on her skin, the way her clothes hung off her like they belonged to someone twice her size. "You look exhausted," Vivian said, leaning forward slightly. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" Grace hesitated, staring at her hands. Her fingers were trembling slightly. I don't know." Vivian's brow furrowed. She hadn't expected such a simple answer to weigh so heavily on her. She rang a small silver bell on the table beside her, and moments later, a housekeeper appeared, quiet and professional. "Prepare some food," Vivian instructed without breaking eye contact with Grace. "Something light, but quick." The housekeeper nodded and disappeared as silently as she had come. Grace shifted uncomfortably. The idea of food, real food, was both tempting and terrifying. She didn't want to seem too eager, but her body ached for it. Vivian, sensing her discomfort, tried a different approach. "How old are you, Grace?" The girl seemed unsure for a moment. 16, she said softly, glancing up for a brief second before her gaze fell back to her lap. 16. Vivian was taken aback. The girl looked younger. Her face had a gauntness that seemed to steal years from her. She was just a child, and yet her eyes told the story of someone who had seen far too much. "What happened?" Vivian asked gently. "How did you end up on the streets?" Grace looked up, startled by the question. She opened her mouth as if to answer, but no words came. The memories, whatever they were buried deep, and it was clear she wasn't ready to dig them up. Not yet. Vivian leaned back, letting the silence stretch between them. "You don't have to tell me now, but you're safe here." Grace's eyes flickered with something. Relief, maybe, or disbelief. She wasn't used to hearing those words. Safe. The streets had taught her that safety was a luxury she didn't get to have. Moments later, the housekeeper returned with a tray of food, soup, bread, and water. Simple, but it smelled heavenly to Grace, who hadn't had a proper meal in days. The tray was placed in front of her, and she hesitated only for a moment before hunger won out. Vivian watched as Grace ate, her movements quick and efficient, like she was afraid the food might be taken away from her at any moment. She ate silently, glancing up now and then to see if Vivian was watching, but Vivian said nothing. When the meal was finished, Grace set the tray aside, and for the first time since stepping into the house, she looked directly at Vivian, as if searching her face for answers. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Vivian paused. She hadn't expected the question to come so soon, but she couldn't blame Grace for asking. People didn't just help others without a reason, especially not in Grace's world. "I don't know," Vivian said after a moment. I saw you and I couldn't leave you there." Grace studied her, her expression unreadable. "People usually do." There was a weight to her words that Vivian recognized all too well, the weight of abandonment, of being forgotten. It hit her harder than she expected, stirring something deep inside her that she had long since buried. She had spent her whole life building an empire, creating a world where she was untouchable, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it felt like to be human. "I'm not most people," Vivian said quietly, and the truth of it settled between them. Grace looked away, as if unsure whether to believe her. Vivian stood up, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she moved. "You can stay here as long as you need," she said, her voice firm but kind. "I'll have one of the guest rooms prepared for you." Grace blinked, surprised. "You're letting me stay here?" Vivian nodded. "I'll have my assistant find you some new clothes tomorrow. And if you need anything, just ask." Grace didn't respond immediately. She sat there, taking it all in. The mansion, the food, the warmth. And it was clear she didn't know what to make of it. No one had ever offered her this kind of kindness before. Not without a price. But Vivian wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't expecting anything in return. And that made it all the more confusing for Grace. As the housekeeper led Grace away to prepare her room, Vivian stood alone in the grand living room, staring after her. She hadn't planned on bringing anyone into her life, especially not like this. But something about Grace had struck a chord in her, something she couldn't quite understand yet. As the silence settled back over the mansion, Vivian felt that familiar sense of loneliness creep in again. But tonight, it didn't feel quite as heavy. The following morning, Vivian sat in her study, staring at her computer screen, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Grace. The girl had slept through the night, quietly tucked away in one of the guest rooms, and hadn't emerged yet. Vivian had instructed the housekeeper to let Grace sleep as long as she needed. Now, as sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her study, casting long shadows across the floor, Vivian found herself growing more curious about the girl. Who was she? What had driven her to the streets? And most importantly, where was her family? Vivian sighed, leaning back in her chair. The familiar urge to compartmentalize her emotions tugged at her, but she resisted. There was something about Grace that made it impossible for her to detach, no matter how much she tried. The sound of quiet footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Vivian stood just as Grace appeared at the doorway, wearing the new clothes her assistant had brought in that morning. Simple jeans and a sweater. They fit her better than the oversized, ragged clothing she had been wearing, but she still looked out of place in the grand mansion, as if she wasn't sure she belonged there. "Good morning," Vivian greeted, her tone warmer than usual. Grace nodded, her expression wary but polite. "Morning." Vivian gestured toward the sofa near the window. "Come, sit down. I thought we could talk a bit about you. And maybe your family." Grace hesitated, her body tense, but after a moment, she stepped forward and sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She didn't look at Vivian directly, her gaze shifting to the floor as if she was already preparing for whatever questions were coming. "I don't want to push you," Vivian said gently, sensing the girl's discomfort. "But I need to know if there's anyone at all, that we should contact. Someone who might be looking for you." Grace's head jerked up slightly, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and confusion. "There's no one," she said quickly. "I don't have a family." The response was immediate, almost rehearsed. It didn't sound like the truth. Vivian leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "Are you sure? No parents, siblings, relatives?" Grace shook her head firmly, her lips pressing into a thin line. I don't remember," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I think I had a family, but it's all jumbled up. I get flashes sometimes, but nothing makes sense." Vivian's heart clenched. She had seen the same look in people before. People who had been through things so painful that their minds shut down, blocking out the worst of the memories. She had seen it in colleagues who had suffered losses, in models who had struggled behind their glamorous facades. But seeing it in Grace, a child, was different. It felt like a punch to the gut. "Flashes of what?" Vivian asked softly, careful not to push too hard. Grace's fingers tightened around the hem of her sweater. "A house," she murmured, her voice distant as if she were speaking more to herself than to Vivian. "There was a house by a lake. I can remember the water. And there were people, but I can't see their faces. It's like they're there, But they're not. She trailed off, her brows furrowed as she tried to grasp at the foggy memories. Vivian watched her closely, trying to piece together what little she could from the girl's scattered thoughts. A lake, Vivian repeated. Do you know where? A city? A name? Grace shook her head, frustrated. I don't know. It's like my mind shuts down whenever I try to think about it. Vivian sat back, exhaling slowly. It was clear that Grace's trauma ran deep, deeper than she had anticipated. But she wasn't willing to give up. If there was a chance that Grace's family was out there, she had to try to find them. We'll take it slow, Vivian said, her voice soothing. I'll make some calls, start looking into missing persons reports. But only if you're okay with that. I won't do anything you don't want. Grace looked up at her, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. You do that? For me? Vivian nodded. Yes, but only if you want me to. The girl was silent for a moment, weighing the offer. Finally, she gave a small nod. Okay. Vivian stood, her mind already racing with plans. She knew people in law enforcement, private investigators, people who owed her favors. If anyone could find a missing family, it would be her. But as she walked toward the door, ready to make the first call, she paused and turned back to Grace. One more thing, she said, her tone more casual now. Would you like to see a doctor? Just for a checkup. I noticed you look a little weak. It might help, just to make sure you're okay. Grace blinked, surprised by the offer. I'm fine. Vivian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You don't have to be. Grace looked away, her fingers pulling at the frayed edges of her sweater. She didn't answer, and Vivian didn't press the issue. But the thought lingered in the back of her mind. If Grace's health was as fragile as it seemed, she couldn't afford to ignore it. Later that afternoon, Vivian sat in her office, the sleek phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking to a contact, a private investigator she had worked with before, a man who specialized in tracking down people who didn't want to be found. I've got a girl here, Vivian said, her voice cool and professional. 16, maybe younger. She says her name is Grace, but she doesn't remember much else. No last name, no solid details. Just vague memories of a lake, maybe a house near it. I need you to start looking into missing persons reports, anything that matches. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the investigator spoke. You're not giving me much to work with, Parker. I know, Vivian replied, her tone sharp, but you're the best at this. Start with Illinois and work outward. Focus on the last 2 years. All right, I'll see what I can dig up, but no promises. Vivian ended the call, leaning back in her chair. As she stared at the city skyline beyond the glass, she couldn't shake the feeling that this search would lead to something much bigger than she anticipated. There was a weight in her chest, a growing suspicion that Grace's past, whatever it was, would be far more complicated than either of them could imagine. And whatever they found, it would change everything. The days following Vivian's decision to find Grace's family were filled with tension and uncertainty. The private investigator had given her little hope with his initial reports. No strong leads, no clear connections to the vague details Grace could remember. Vivian could feel the pressure building, as though each passing day was pulling Grace further away from the answers she needed. Grace herself had grown quieter, retreating into a shell of caution, perhaps afraid of remembering too much. She seemed to sense that something in her past wasn't right. But no matter how much Vivian reassured her, Grace resisted any deeper conversations about her life before the streets. The only real detail that stood out was the lake, a persistent image in Grace's fragmented memories. Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding just beyond reach, both in Grace's past and her own thoughts. Her mind drifted back to the life she had buried long ago, the one she'd left behind when her career consumed everything. One cold, gray morning, Vivian found herself standing in the same place she always did before work, in front of the grand windows of her penthouse, coffee in hand, looking out at the city. But this morning felt different. Something was pulling at her memories, a haunting whisper from the past. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, an image surfaced. A boy's laughter, a shared childhood memory of running through fields by a small, sparkling lake. Her breath caught in her throat as she remembered him. Michael. Michael had been her best friend growing up. They had been inseparable as children, both fascinated with the world of fashion, even then, dreaming of success. Vivian had always assumed their paths would lead them to build something together. But everything had changed after high school. Michael had disappeared. No one had heard from him again. His family had been devastated, and rumors spread that he had run away, though no one knew why. Vivian had never gotten closure. It was as if he had been erased from her life overnight. Vivian opened her eyes and stared into her reflection in the glass. She hadn't thought about Michael in years. Why now? Why, after meeting Grace, was she suddenly remembering him? Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. It was the private investigator. "What have you found?" Vivian answered, her voice sharper than she intended. "There's something you should know," the investigator began, his tone cautious. "It's not much, but it's a lead. I found a case involving a missing family that might match some of the details Grace mentioned." Vivian's heart quickened. "Go on." "The report is old, though, from over a decade ago. It's from a small town near Lake Michigan, an incident involving a man who vanished under strange circumstances. His name was Michael. Michael Harrington." The name hit Vivian like a physical blow. She nearly dropped the phone. "What did you say?" "Harrington. Michael Harrington. Disappeared 12 years ago." His daughter, Grace, would have been about 4 years old at the time. Vivian's mind raced. It couldn't be. Michael had a daughter? And Grace, this Grace, was his daughter? "That's impossible," Vivian said, though even as she said it, she felt the sinking weight of truth. She had thought of Michael as a part of her past, someone who had disappeared into the void. But if Grace was his daughter, that meant Michael had been out there all along, hiding from something or someone. "Look, I don't have all the details yet," the investigator continued, his voice tight with urgency. "But from what I can gather, Michael didn't just vanish. He was in some kind of trouble, something big. I'll keep digging, but you need to be prepared. This isn't just a case of someone running away. There's a lot more at play." Vivian didn't answer immediately. She felt the walls of her world closing in, suffocating her as pieces of her past crashed into the present. Michael, Grace, the lake. It was all connected, and yet the full picture was still out of reach. "I'll be in touch," the investigator said, his tone softer now, as though he could sense the storm brewing on the other end of the line. Vivian ended the call and sank into her chair, her mind spinning. Michael had been alive this whole time, living in the shadows, hiding his daughter from something or someone. And now, Grace was here, in her home, unaware of the danger that likely surrounded her. Later that evening, as Vivian paced her study, she heard a knock at the door. Grace stood in the doorway, looking nervous, as if she had picked up on Vivian's distress. "Can I come in?" Grace asked softly. Vivian gestured for her to enter, her eyes studying the girl with a new intensity. Now that she knew who Grace was, every detail of her face, every mannerism, seemed to carry the shadow of Michael. The connection was undeniable. "Are you okay?" Grace asked, sitting cautiously on the edge of a chair. "You seem different today." Vivian forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside her. "I'm fine, Grace. Just thinking about some things." Grace didn't seem convinced. She looked at Vivian with those sharp, searching eyes, the same eyes Michael had. Eyes that didn't miss much. "You're lying," she said quietly. Vivian paused, surprised by Grace's bluntness. She didn't know what to say. Could she tell Grace the truth? That she had found out who she really was? That she had known her father, Michael, once? Or would that be too much for the girl to handle? Instead, Vivian opted for a half-truth. "I've been looking into your past, trying to find out who you are, who your family is." Grace stiffened, her posture suddenly tense. "Did you find anything?" Vivian nodded slowly. "I found something. A name. Michael Harrington." Grace's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. "Michael," she whispered, the name tasting foreign on her tongue. That was my father, wasn't it?" Vivian nodded again, watching the emotions flicker across Grace's face. Confusion, pain, and something else. Fear. "He's gone, isn't he?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Vivian felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't have all the answers yet, but from what the investigator had told her, it didn't seem likely that Michael was still alive. She wanted to protect Grace from the full weight of that truth, but lying wouldn't help. "I don't know yet," Vivian said, choosing her words carefully, "but I'm going to find out." Grace's hands were trembling now, and she stared down at them, blinking back tears. "I don't remember him," she whispered. "I can't even remember what he looked like. I don't remember anything about him." Vivian's heart ached for the girl. She reached out, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Grace. Whatever happened, we'll figure it out together." Grace looked up, her eyes glassy but determined. "I want to know. I need to know what happened to him." Vivian nodded, feeling the weight of the promise she was making. The truth, whatever it was bound to be painful. But there was no turning back now. Together, they would uncover the secrets that had stolen Michael from their lives. And whatever they found, it would change everything again. Vivian sat in the glow of her desk lamp late into the night, the silence of the mansion pressing down on her as the weight of the truth began to unravel. The revelation that Grace was Michael's daughter had shaken her to her core. She hadn't thought about Michael for years, but now every memory was flooding back. Their childhood, his sudden disappearance, the gaping hole he left in her life. It made sense now. Michael had disappeared to protect his daughter. But from what? And why had Grace ended up on the streets, alone and lost? There was more to this story, and Vivian needed to uncover it. As her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness of the room, Vivian quickly answered, her heart racing with anticipation. It was the private investigator again. "I've got something," his voice came through, low and tense. "But you're not going to like it." Vivian's grip on the phone tightened. "Tell me." "I've been digging through old business records, trying to find connections between Michael's disappearance and anything that might explain why Grace was hidden. Turns out, Michael didn't just vanish. He was forced to disappear. He uncovered something dangerous." Vivian's stomach twisted with dread. What did he find? A conspiracy. It involves high-level figures in the fashion world, people you might know. Some of them are tied to illegal activities, money laundering, human trafficking, exploitation. Michael stumbled upon it when he was working with a business partner, and it put a target on his back. He had to go into hiding to protect Grace. But they found him. Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. Who are these people? The investigator paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. Vivian, the names that come up are powerful. They're not just businessmen. They're people in the same industry you built your empire in. And some of them, well, they've been close to you. A cold chill settled over her. Close to me? Who? There was a long silence before the investigator spoke again. "I'm still piecing it together, but one name keeps coming up. Evelyn Beaumont." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Evelyn Beaumont. Her most formidable rival in the fashion world. A woman who had always seemed to linger just in the background, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The two had never gotten along. Evelyn had always been envious of Vivian's meteoric rise, her ability to capture the spotlight and dominate the industry. But could Evelyn really be involved in something so sinister? "I know it's hard to believe," the investigator continued, "but Michael was convinced Evelyn was part of this. She's not just after the spotlight. She's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years, working with people who have no limits. When Michael found out what she was involved in, he was silenced." Vivian leaned back in her chair, trying to process the information. It was almost too much to believe. She had always known Evelyn was ruthless, but this? It seemed too dark, too monstrous, even for her. "Why didn't Michael go to the police?" Vivian asked, her voice hollow. "He tried," the investigator said, "but these people are protected by money, power, influence. When he realized he couldn't expose them without putting Grace in danger, he disappeared. But they caught up with him eventually." Vivian's mind raced, her pulse quickening. Michael had sacrificed everything for his daughter, only for Grace to end up on the streets, abandoned and alone. And now, Grace was living under her roof, oblivious to the fact that her father's enemies might still be watching. "Do they know about Grace?" Vivian asked, dread curling in her stomach. "I don't know," the investigator replied. But if they do, she's in serious danger. Vivian's heart pounded. Grace, the girl who had no idea the dark forces that had destroyed her father's life were still out there, waiting in the shadows. And now, they could come after her. I'll keep looking, the investigator said. But you need to be careful. If these people know you're involved, it's not just Grace that's at risk. You are too. Vivian nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I understand. When the call ended, the silence of the room felt suffocating. Vivian stood up, pacing the floor as her mind churned through the possibilities. Evelyn had always been a threat, but she had underestimated just how deep her rival's ambition ran. If Evelyn was capable of orchestrating something like this, then there was no telling how far she'd go to protect her secrets. Vivian's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, trying to calm her nerves. Her empire, her life, had been built on the idea that hard work and talent were enough to succeed. But now she realized how blind she had been. The world of high fashion wasn't just about designs and creativity. It was about power and the lengths people would go to maintain it. The next morning, Grace found Vivian in the study, staring out the window, her reflection in the glass distant and cold. The girl approached cautiously, sensing the shift in the air. Vivian, Grace said softly, stepping closer. Is something wrong? Vivian turned, her face composed, though the storm inside her was far from calm. We need to talk, she said, motioning for Grace to sit. Grace's face paled. She sat slowly, her hands clutching her sleeves, as if bracing for something terrible. Vivian sat across from her, choosing her words carefully. I found out more about your father, she began, watching Grace's reaction closely. Grace's eyes widened with a mix of fear and hope. What did you find? Vivian hesitated for a moment, then said, Your father didn't just disappear. He was hiding, because he found something dangerous, something that put both of you at risk. Grace's brows furrowed. What do you mean? What did he find? Vivian's throat tightened. A conspiracy. It involves powerful people. People in the business world, the fashion industry, who are doing terrible things. Your father was trying to protect you from them. Grace's eyes darkened with confusion and fear. Who? Who are these people? Vivian paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. One of them is Evelyn Beaumont. Grace blinked, the name unfamiliar to her, but she could sense the gravity of it from Vivian's tone. Who is she? She's my rival, Vivian explained, her voice tight with emotion. A woman I've worked against for years. But I didn't realize just how dangerous she was. Grace looked down, her fingers trembling. So, what now? What do we do? Vivian took a deep breath. We need to be careful. We need to figure out who else is involved and why your father was targeted. But most of all, we need to keep you safe. Grace nodded, though the weight of everything was clearly overwhelming her. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice trembling. Vivian reached across the table, taking Grace's hands in hers. You don't have to be scared, Grace. I'll protect you. I promised your father, whether he's alive or not, that I would find the truth. And I won't stop until I do. Grace looked up, her eyes filled with tears, but there was a spark of determination there too. She squeezed Vivian's hands, her grip tight and desperate. Thank you, she whispered. Vivian nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever danger lay ahead, she would face it. For Grace, for Michael, and for the truth that had been buried for too long. The tension in Vivian's mansion had become palpable. Since the revelation about Michael's fate and Evelyn Beaumont's possible involvement, Vivian had been on high alert. Every noise in the house seemed louder, every shadow more menacing. Even though she kept a calm exterior for Grace's sake, inside, Vivian's mind was a storm of thoughts, questions, fears, and suspicions about who might be watching them. It was late in the evening when the first sign of danger appeared. Vivian was in her study, sorting through the scattered files from the investigator, when her phone buzzed with a new message. She unlocked the screen, her eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar number. The message was short, but it sent a cold chill down her spine. Stop digging, Vivian, or you'll regret it. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around her. She read the message again, her pulse quickening with the unmistakable sense of being watched. There was no signature, no hint of who had sent it, but she already knew. Evelyn. Vivian stared at the phone, her mind racing. She had expected something like this eventually, but the reality of it hit harder than she anticipated. It wasn't just about her anymore. Grace was involved, innocent and unaware of the full scope of danger she was now facing. Vivian stood up, walking to the large windows of her study. She scanned the darkened streets outside, looking for any sign of surveillance, any clue that someone was nearby. The city below was alive, as it always was, but there was something sinister in the air tonight. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Vivian turned quickly, her heart still pounding. Grace stood there, her face pale, as if she could sense the unease in the air. "Vivian?" Grace asked quietly. "Is everything okay?" Vivian forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Come in, Grace. We need to talk." Grace stepped inside, her eyes flickering to the files scattered across the desk, the tension in the room unmistakable. She sat down slowly, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Vivian sat across from her, trying to find the right words. How could she tell Grace the full extent of the danger without terrifying her? How could she protect this girl, who had already been through so much? "There's something I need to tell you," Vivian began, her voice low but firm. "We're not just searching for answers anymore. There are people, dangerous people, who don't want us to find the truth about your father." Grace's eyes widened, fear immediately flashing across her face. "What do you mean? What kind of people?" Vivian hesitated for a moment, then said, "Evelyn Beaumont. She's more dangerous than we thought, and she's not working alone. There's a network of powerful people involved in things that your father discovered, illegal activities. He tried to protect you by hiding, but it wasn't enough. Now they know we're looking into it, and they've threatened us." Grace's face drained of color. "Threatened us? What do they want?" "They want us to stop," Vivian said softly. "They want us to drop the investigation, but we can't. We're too close to finding out what really happened." Grace's hands clenched into fists. "But what if they hurt you? Or me?" Vivian leaned forward, her eyes fierce with determination. "I won't let that happen. I have security. I'll hire more if I have to. But we're not backing down, Grace. Not now." For a long moment, Grace said nothing. She sat there, staring at the floor, her mind clearly racing. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling, but there was a steely resolve beneath the fear. "I want to help," Grace said. "Whatever happens, I want to know the truth about my father. I need to know." Vivian felt a surge of pride at Grace's courage. She nodded. "We'll figure this out together. But from now on, we have to be careful. No talking about this outside the house. No mentioning names. If anything feels wrong, you tell me immediately." Grace nodded, though the fear in her eyes hadn't lessened. The next morning, Vivian awoke to a series of missed calls. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw that most of them were from the investigator. She quickly dialed his number, pacing the length of her bedroom as she waited for him to pick up. "Vivian." The investigator's voice came through, tense and hurried. "We've got a serious problem." "What now?" she asked, her stomach sinking. "They've started moving," he said grimly. "People are covering their tracks, erasing records, threatening anyone who might know something. The deeper I dig, the more I find connections leading back to your world. The fashion industry, corporate elites, politicians. I'm talking about some of the most powerful people in the country." Vivian's blood ran cold. She had known this would be dangerous, but the scope of it was terrifying. "Are you saying they know we're onto them?" "I'm saying they're prepared to do anything to stop us. And it's not just Evelyn Beaumont. She's part of it, yes, but this goes much higher than her. It's a full-blown conspiracy, and we're standing right in the middle of it." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. "What should I do?" The investigator was silent for a moment, as if weighing his next words. "You need to get out of this, Vivian. You and Grace. Whatever they're planning, it's bigger than we can handle." Vivian's mind reeled. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. She had spent too long protecting her empire, and she couldn't abandon Grace now. But the thought of going head-to-head with a network of criminals, people with limitless resources and connections, was overwhelming. I'm not running, she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. I'm not letting them win. The investigator sighed. All right, but just know, if you keep going, there's no turning back. They'll come for you, and they won't stop until you're silenced. I understand, Vivian said. Do what you can to keep us safe. But I'm not giving up. That night, Vivian felt the pressure building. As she moved through the mansion, checking locks, setting up additional security measures, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walls seemed to close in on her, and every sound made her tense. Grace, too, had grown quieter, her fear more evident as the hours passed. She lingered close to Vivian, as if sensing that danger was lurking just outside the doors. After dinner, Vivian found Grace sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at the fire. She approached her cautiously, sitting down beside her. "Are you all right?" Vivian asked gently. Grace looked up, her eyes filled with worry. "I'm scared. What if they find us?" Vivian placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They won't. I've hired more security. We're safe here." Grace nodded, though the fear didn't leave her eyes. "Do you think my father knew this was coming? That they'd come after us like this?" Vivian swallowed hard. "He must have. That's why he went into hiding. He tried to protect you. And now, it's my turn to protect you." Grace looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wish I could remember more. I wish I knew why they're after us." Vivian nodded, understanding the weight of Grace's frustration. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening. Another message from the unknown number. "This is your last warning, Vivian. Walk away, or you'll both disappear just like Michael." Vivian stared at the words, her pulse racing. The threat was no longer subtle. They were coming for her, and for Grace. But there was no way she could walk away now. They had crossed the line, and Vivian wasn't going to stop until she uncovered every secret, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia. The mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, set Vivian and Grace on edge. The threat was constant, invisible, but always present, pressing down on them with a suffocating weight. Vivian had doubled the security around the estate, hiring private guards to patrol the grounds day and night. But even with the precautions, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the new message, the one that had so openly threatened her life and Grace's, hung over her like a dark cloud. But it wasn't just fear that gnawed at Vivian. It was the growing sense that she was missing something. Someone within her own circle had betrayed her, feeding information to Evelyn and her powerful network. It was the only way the threats had gotten so personal, so specific. Someone close to her was playing both sides. Vivian paced her office, her mind racing. There was no one she could fully trust anymore. Her empire had been built on fierce loyalty and calculated partnerships, but now, those same alliances felt fragile, tainted. Evelyn had always been a rival, but for her to have this level of access to her life, it meant someone in her own world, was feeding her information. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the door. Vivian froze, her body tense, as the door creaked open. Leah, her assistant, stepped in, a folder clutched in her hands. "Vivian?" Leah asked cautiously, her voice soft. "You called for me?" Vivian nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. Leah had been with her for years, trusted implicitly. But now, as Vivian stared at her, doubt began to creep in. Could Leah be the one? Could she have been working for Evelyn all this time? "I need to ask you something," Vivian said, her voice calm but firm. "And I need you to be honest with me." Leah frowned, sensing the tension in the room. "Of course. What is it?" Vivian leaned forward, her eyes locked on Leah's. "Have you spoken to anyone outside of the company about what's been happening here? About Grace, about the investigation?" Leah blinked, her expression a mix of confusion and surprise. "No, of course not. Why would I do that?" Vivian studied her, searching for any hint of deception. But Leah's face remained sincere, her brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Because someone is feeding information to Evelyn Beaumont, Vivian said, her tone sharp. And whoever it is, they know things they shouldn't. Personal things. Leah's eyes widened in shock. Vivian, I swear to you, I haven't told anyone anything. I would never betray you like that. Vivian leaned back in her chair, her mind still whirling. Leah seemed sincere, but then again, betrayal often came from those who appeared the most loyal. She couldn't afford to trust blindly anymore. I believe you, Vivian said finally, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. But from now on, I need you to be extra careful. No calls, no emails, nothing that could be tracked or intercepted. If anyone tries to contact you about this, you come to me immediately. Understood? Leah nodded, her face pale. Of course, Vivian. I'll be careful. Vivian watched as Leah left the room, a knot of unease tightening in her chest. Leah wasn't the only possible suspect. There were others in her orbit, colleagues, investors, even friends, who could have been swayed by Evelyn's influence. But until she knew for sure, everyone was a suspect. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace sat quietly in the living room, curled up on the sofa with a blanket. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Despite the warmth, Grace felt cold, her mind unable to rest. Vivian entered the room, sitting down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears. I've been thinking, Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, about my father, about what he did to protect me. Vivian nodded, her heart aching for the girl. Grace had been so strong through all of this, but Vivian could see the cracks forming, the fear, the uncertainty. I wish I could remember more, Grace continued, her eyes staring into the flickering flames. I feel like there's something important I'm forgetting. Something about him, about what he was trying to protect me from. Vivian placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, her voice soft. You will remember, Grace. In time. And whatever it is, we'll face it together. Grace looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But what if it's too late? What if they find us first? Vivian's chest tightened. She didn't have an easy answer. The truth was, they were running out of time. The threats were growing more direct, more dangerous. And the people hunting them weren't the type to give second chances. We won't let that happen, Vivian said firmly. I promise. The next morning, Vivian received a call from the investigator. His voice was hurried, laced with urgency. We have a problem, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. There's been a leak. Someone close to you has been feeding information directly to Evelyn's people. Vivian's pulse quickened. Who? I don't have a name yet, but I've narrowed it down. It's someone on your team, someone with access to sensitive details about Grace and the investigation. Vivian's mind raced. Leah? Could it be her after all? Or was it someone else? Someone she hadn't even suspected? You need to be careful, Vivian, the investigator warned. Whoever this is, they're working closely with Evelyn. And they're not just passing along information. They're actively sabotaging your efforts. Vivian clenched her jaw. What do you mean? Remember the files you asked me to retrieve about Michael's disappearance? The documents that were supposed to link Evelyn to the conspiracy? They've been altered. Key pieces of evidence are missing, and the trail has gone cold. Someone is covering their tracks. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest. Whoever was betraying her had access to everything. Her business, her life, her search for the truth about Grace's father. And they were actively working to destroy any chance she had of exposing the conspiracy. Find them, Vivian said, her voice low and dangerous. Whoever this is, find them. I will. The investigator promised. But you need to be careful. If they're this close to you, there's no telling what they'll do next. Vivian ended the call, her hands trembling with rage. She had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing the players in every game. But now, she felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, unstable. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was waiting for her to make the wrong move. That afternoon, Vivian received another message from the unknown number. This one was different. It wasn't a threat, but a chilling revelation. It's not just Evelyn. You've been betrayed by someone you trust the most. Check the files. Look closer. The truth has been staring you in the face all along. Vivian's blood ran cold as she read the message. Her hands shook as she rushed to her office, pulling out the files that had been left on her desk, the same files Leah had brought her just days ago. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages, scanning them for anything out of place. And then she saw it, an email chain buried deep in the documents. A correspondence between Evelyn Beaumont and someone inside Parker Atelier. The name had been redacted, but the pattern was clear. Someone on Vivian's team had been feeding Evelyn insider information for months, perhaps even years. Vivian's mind spun. It was right there, in front of her. The betrayal wasn't from an outsider. It was someone she had trusted with everything, and she was about to find out who. Vivian's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents on her desk, her eyes scanning the email chain again and again. The message was clear. Someone she trusted had been feeding Evelyn Beaumont sensitive information, sabotaging her every move. Her mind whirled as she tried to piece together the puzzle, the betrayal cutting deeper than she could have ever imagined. Her first thought was Leah, but there were others who had access to her personal files. People who had been with her for years, who knew her every move. But one name kept surfacing in her mind, a name she had tried to push away, Conrad Ellis, her longtime business partner. They had built Parker Atelier together, shared the highs and lows of the business, and navigated the treacherous waters of the fashion world. But in recent years, she had sensed something off about him. He had grown distant, more secretive, and had often pushed for deals with people she didn't fully trust. Could Conrad really be the one behind the betrayal? Could he have been working with Evelyn all along, feeding her information to dismantle Vivian's empire from within? Vivian's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The investments, the sudden shifts in Conrad's loyalty, his strange absences during key moments of the investigation. It all pointed to him. He had access to everything: the business, her personal life, and most importantly, the investigation into Michael's disappearance. But the betrayal didn't just end with business. If Conrad had been leaking information to Evelyn, he was putting Grace's life in danger. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. That evening, as the sky darkened and the city lights flickered outside the mansion, Vivian sat in her living room, staring into the fire. Grace was upstairs, likely lost in thought, unaware of the storm that was brewing around them. Vivian knew she couldn't keep this from Grace any longer. She had to tell her the truth, not just about Michael's fate, but about the betrayal that had brought them to this dangerous moment. Taking a deep breath, she stood and climbed the stairs to Grace's room, her heart heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. When she knocked softly on the door, Grace opened it, her face tired but alert. She had sensed the tension in the house over the past few days, and it had left her on edge. "Vivian," Grace said, her voice quiet. "Is something wrong?" Vivian stepped inside and motioned for Grace to sit on the edge of the bed. "There's something we need to talk about," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I've found out more about what happened to your father." Grace's eyes widened with anticipation, her body tensing as she braced herself for the news. "Michael didn't just disappear because he found something dangerous," Vivian continued. "He was betrayed by people he trusted. And now, it's happening again. Someone close to us, someone we thought we could trust, has been working with Evelyn Beaumont." Grace's face drained of color. "Who?" Vivian hesitated for a moment, then said, "I think it's Conrad Ellis. He's been my business partner for years, but I have reason to believe he's been feeding information to Evelyn. He's been sabotaging our efforts to find out the truth about your father." Grace's eyes filled with disbelief, her hands clenching into fists. "Conrad? But why? Why would he do that?" Vivian sighed, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her. "I don't know yet. Maybe it's money, or maybe he's protecting himself. But what I do know is that we can't trust him anymore. We can't trust anyone except each other." Grace was silent for a long moment, processing the enormity of what Vivian had just revealed. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vivian sat down beside her, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We fight." Grace looked at her, confused. "Fight? How?" Vivian took a deep breath, knowing the decision she was about to make would change everything. We expose them. Conrad, Evelyn, and everyone else involved in this conspiracy. Your father tried to protect you by running and hiding, but we're not going to run. We're going to take them down. Grace's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and determination flickering across her face. But how? They're so powerful. They have connections, money, people who will protect them. I know, Vivian said, her voice firm, but we have something they don't: proof. The investigator has been collecting evidence, documents that link Evelyn and Conrad to illegal activities, to your father's disappearance. We can use that to bring them down. Grace stared at her, a flicker of hope lighting in her eyes. So we can stop them? We can make sure they can't hurt anyone else? Vivian nodded. Yes, but it won't be easy. They'll come after us. They'll try to silence us. But I'm ready. I've spent my entire life fighting for what's mine, and I'm not going to let them win. Grace's expression hardened, her fear slowly giving way to determination. I'm with you. Whatever it takes, I want to help. Vivian smiled, feeling a surge of pride at the strength in Grace's voice. Good, because we're going to need all the help we can get. The next morning, Vivian wasted no time. She called a meeting with her legal team, the private investigator, and a few trusted allies who had stood by her throughout the years. The plan was simple but dangerous: gather the evidence, confront Conrad, and expose Evelyn's network to the authorities. As they sat around the conference table, the air was thick with tension. The investigator laid out the documents he had uncovered, a trail of corruption that led straight to Conrad and Evelyn. Once we release this, the investigator said, his voice grave, there's no going back. You'll be putting a target on your back? Vivian nodded, her face set with resolve. I understand, but we're ready. This needs to end. Grace sat beside her, quiet but focused. She had grown stronger over the past few weeks, her fear now tempered with a fierce determination to honor her father's memory and bring justice to those who had wronged him. As they finalized their plans, Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Conrad's name. The call was unexpected, and Vivian knew it could only mean one thing. Conrad had caught wind of their investigation. With a steady hand, she answered the call. Vivian. Conrad's voice came through, smooth but with an edge of desperation. We need to talk. It's important. Vivian's grip on the phone tightened. I think we do. Not over the phone, Conrad insisted. Meet me tonight. Just the two of us. Vivian's mind raced. She knew this was a trap. Conrad was getting desperate, and he was likely planning to confront her, or worse. But she needed to face him, needed to hear the truth from his own lips. I'll be there, Vivian said, her voice cold. After hanging up, she turned to the room. It's happening tonight. Conrad wants to meet. I'm going to confront him. The investigator looked uneasy. Are you sure that's a good idea? He could be dangerous. Vivian's eyes hardened. I know, but it's time we finish this. That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Vivian prepared herself for the meeting with Conrad. She knew this confrontation would be the turning point, the moment when all the lies, betrayals, and secrets would come crashing down. And when it was over, she would have the truth. Grace stood by her side, her eyes filled with concern. Are you sure you want to do this alone? She asked. Vivian smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. I have to. But don't worry. I'll be careful. As Vivian left the mansion and stepped into the car, her mind was clear, her heart steady. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would take control of her life, her empire, and the truth. And no matter what happened, she was ready to fight for justice, no matter the cost. The cold Chicago night had settled in, and as Vivian's car moved through the quiet streets, her mind was sharp, focused. The city that had once felt like her domain now seemed foreign, filled with danger lurking in the shadows. But she couldn't afford to let fear dictate her actions. She was heading straight into the heart of the storm, ready to confront Conrad Ellis, the man she had once trusted with her empire, her secrets, and, unknowingly, her life. The investigator had tried to convince her to bring backup, to have security close by in case Conrad turned violent. But Vivian knew this meeting had to be just between the two of them. She needed to hear the truth from him, face to face. She needed to look him in the eyes and see the man behind the betrayal. The car pulled up outside a sleek, modern restaurant, the kind of place Conrad frequented for business deals and high-stakes negotiations. Inside, it was all polished chrome and glass, with dim lighting that cast long shadows across the room. The perfect place for quiet, discreet meetings. Vivian stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she made her way to the entrance. She could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Every step she took was filled with purpose. She wasn't walking into this unprepared. Inside, the restaurant was nearly empty. Only a few tables were occupied, and at the far corner, Conrad sat alone, nursing a glass of whiskey. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Vivian," he greeted, standing up as she reached the table. "I'm glad you came." Vivian didn't smile, didn't offer any warmth. She simply sat down, her eyes fixed on Conrad, her every sense heightened. "You said we needed to talk," she said, her voice cool. "So let's talk." Conrad sat back down, swirling the whiskey in his glass as he studied her. There was something different about him tonight. His usual charm and confidence were strained, like a man walking a tightrope over a pit of secrets. "I'll get straight to the point," Conrad began, his tone measured. "I know what you've been doing. The investigation, the digging. You're getting close to something dangerous, Vivian. Too close." Vivian's heart raced, but her face remained impassive. "I know about Michael," she said bluntly, watching his reaction closely. "I know what he found out. And I know that you've been working with Evelyn Beaumont to cover it up." Conrad's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, or guilt. But he quickly regained his composure. "It's more complicated than that," he said, leaning forward. "You don't understand the full picture." "Then explain it to me," Vivian replied, her voice edged with steel. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been betraying me for years." Conrad sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of his secrets were finally catching up to him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It started with a few deals, connections I made with Evelyn's people. It was all business at first. But then Michael got involved. He found out about the money laundering, the trafficking, all of it. He threatened to expose us, and we had no choice." Vivian's stomach turned. "No choice? You had him killed." Conrad's gaze darkened. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. We were just trying to silence him, keep him from blowing everything open. But things escalated, and before we knew it, Michael was gone." Vivian's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. "And Grace?" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "You left her to fend for herself. You let her live on the streets, terrified and alone, while you covered up your crimes." Conrad flinched at the mention of Grace, his guilt evident. "We didn't know where she was. After Michael disappeared, everything spiraled out of control. Evelyn wanted to clean up loose ends, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her hurt Grace." "That's your excuse?" Vivian spat, her voice cold with disgust. "You couldn't protect her, but you could protect Evelyn's empire? The trafficking? The money laundering?" Conrad looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "You don't understand how deep this goes, Vivian. The people involved, they're not just in the fashion industry. There are politicians, law enforcement, people with more power than you can imagine. They'll destroy anyone who threatens them." Vivian's pulse quickened. She had known the conspiracy ran deep, but hearing it confirmed from Conrad's mouth made the danger all too real. "You didn't just betray Michael," Vivian said, her voice low and dangerous. "You betrayed me. You put Grace's life at risk. And for what? Money? Power?" Conrad's face twisted with regret. "I didn't have a choice, Vivian. You think I wanted this? I got pulled in too deep, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." Vivian stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She couldn't listen to his excuses any longer. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "But you chose to protect yourself, and now you're going to pay for it." Conrad looked up at her, fear creeping into his eyes. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to expose all of you," Vivian said, her tone deadly serious. You, Evelyn, everyone involved in this. I've already started gathering the evidence. The authorities will be next. Conrad stood up, his face pale. You don't know what you're doing, Vivian. They'll come for you. They'll come for Grace. Vivian's eyes flashed with fury. Let them come. I'm not running, Conrad. I'm not hiding. And I'm not going to let you or Evelyn destroy any more lives. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of Vivian's words hanging in the air between them. Conrad's confidence had shattered, and all that was left was a man who had lost control of his own life. Finally, Vivian turned and walked away, leaving Conrad standing alone in the dimly lit restaurant. As she stepped out into the cold night, her heart pounded with the knowledge that this was far from over. The fight was only beginning, and the enemies she had made would stop at nothing to silence her. Back at the mansion, Vivian found Grace waiting in the living room, her face filled with anxious anticipation. The moment Vivian walked in, Grace stood up, her eyes searching Vivian's for answers. What happened? Grace asked, her voice tight with worry. Vivian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had just uncovered. It's done, she said quietly. I confronted Conrad. He admitted everything. He's been working with Evelyn for years. Grace's face paled. What does that mean for us? It means we need to move quickly, Vivian replied, her mind racing. The moment Conrad realizes I'm serious about exposing him, he'll try to shut us down. But we have the evidence. We have everything we need to bring them down. Grace looked at her, her fear evident but her determination stronger. What do we do now? We fight, Vivian said, her voice steady with resolve. We take this to the authorities, and we expose every last one of them. Grace nodded, her eyes hardening with the same resolve. I'm with you. Vivian smiled, a surge of pride swelling in her chest. Good, because they won't stop until we stop them first. The next day, Vivian's team worked tirelessly to finalize the evidence, compiling everything they had on Evelyn, Conrad, and the network of powerful figures behind the conspiracy. It was risky, but it was the only way to bring the truth to light. By evening, they were ready. Vivian made the call to a trusted contact in the FBI, someone who had been quietly monitoring the case for months. We have the evidence, Vivian said, her voice steady. It's time. Within hours, the wheels were in motion. The FBI began their operation, targeting key figures, freezing accounts, and securing documents that would blow the conspiracy wide open. Evelyn's empire, once untouchable, was now on the brink of collapse. But as the night stretched on, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. Vivian knew that people like Evelyn didn't go down without a fight. There would be retaliation, and the danger wasn't over yet. Late that night, as the mansion quieted, Vivian stood by the window, watching the city lights in the distance. Grace appeared beside her, her presence a quiet comfort. Do you think we're safe now? Grace asked softly. Vivian turned to her, her eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. We've started something big, and once the truth is out, there's no going back. But whatever happens next, we face it together. Grace nodded, her hand resting gently on Vivian's arm. Thank you for everything. Vivian smiled, her heart filled with determination. Your father tried to protect you, Grace, and now I will too. Until the end. The two stood there, side by side, knowing that the storm was far from over, but ready to face whatever came next. Because in the fight for justice, there could be no turning back. The following week felt like a whirlwind. The FBI moved swiftly, executing arrests, seizing assets, and dismantling the criminal network that had operated in the shadows for so long. News outlets erupted with headlines about corruption, money laundering, and human trafficking, exposing the rot at the highest levels of the fashion industry and beyond. Evelyn Beaumont's empire crumbled overnight. She was taken into custody, her power stripped, her influence shattered. For Vivian and Grace, it seemed like the nightmare was finally over. The truth about Michael's disappearance had come to light. His name was cleared, his legacy restored, and the people responsible for his suffering were now facing justice. But despite the victory, there was an unsettling calm in the aftermath, a sense that something still lingered in the air, unfinished, unresolved. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, casting a golden light over the skyline, Vivian and Grace sat together in the mansion's living room. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. It was the first moment of peace they had had in weeks. "Do you think it's really over?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had grown stronger in the past weeks, her fear replaced with a quiet resilience. But there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Vivian glanced at her, considering the question. She wanted to say yes, to reassure Grace that the worst was behind them, but she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beyond their reach. "I hope so," Vivian replied, her voice soft but careful. "We've done everything we can. The truth is out, and the people responsible are facing justice." Grace nodded, but her gaze drifted toward the window, where the last light of day was fading into twilight. "I just wish I could remember more about him," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of sadness and longing. "My father. I feel like I don't even know who he was." Vivian's heart ached for Grace. She had lost so much: her father, her childhood, her sense of security. But now, with the truth finally revealed, Grace had a chance to rebuild, to heal. "You will," Vivian said, placing a hand gently on Grace's shoulder. "You'll remember him in time, and I'll tell you everything I can about him. He loved you more than anything, Grace. He gave up everything to protect you." Grace blinked back tears, her lips trembling as she fought to keep her composure. "Thank you, Vivian, for everything. You didn't have to do this, but you did. You saved me." Vivian smiled softly, her chest tight with emotion. "You saved me too, Grace." The two of them sat in silence for a long while, the weight of their shared journey hanging in the air. It felt like the beginning of something new, a future where they could finally move forward. But just as the silence settled, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. Vivian and Grace exchanged a glance, both of them immediately on edge. The FBI had been discreet with their involvement, and no one outside of the investigation should have known their location. Vivian stood up, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked toward the door. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it cautiously. Standing on the doorstep was a man, tall with a weathered face, his dark hair streaked with gray. His eyes, though tired, were sharp, filled with a depth of emotion that took Vivian by surprise. Her breath caught in her throat. There was something familiar about him, something that stirred memories she hadn't touched in years. "Vivian," the man said, his voice hoarse, filled with a mix of relief and pain. Vivian blinked, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her legs felt weak, her heart hammering in her chest as the truth hit her like a tidal wave. "Michael," she whispered, barely able to believe her own eyes. The man nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's me." Vivian stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as the weight of the moment crashed over her. She had spent years believing Michael was dead, killed in the wake of his discovery. And now, here he was, standing on her doorstep, alive. "How?" Vivian's voice broke, unable to finish the question. Michael stepped inside, his movements slow, as if every step was filled with the pain of a life spent running. "I had to disappear," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was the only way to protect Grace. I was going to come back for her, but things spiraled out of control. I never wanted her to suffer like this." Tears streamed down Vivian's face as she stared at him, her mind racing to catch up with the impossible reality in front of her. "We thought you were gone. Grace thought you were gone." Michael's face crumpled with guilt. "I know. I'm so sorry, Vivian. I never wanted to leave her. I've been hiding, watching, trying to stay one step ahead of them. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if she was safe." Vivian felt a sob rise in her throat, but before she could say another word, Grace appeared in the hallway, her eyes wide with confusion. "Vivian? What's going on?" Grace's voice trembled as she stepped closer, her gaze falling on the man standing in front of her. Michael turned slowly, his breath catching as his eyes met Grace's. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with emotion. "Grace," Michael whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of years lost. "It's me. It's your father." Grace's face went pale, her legs trembling as if they might give out beneath her. "What, how?" Michael took a tentative step toward her, his eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted to leave you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped thinking about you. You were the only thing that kept me going." Grace stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths as the reality of the moment washed over her. She had spent years longing for answers, for a connection to the father she barely remembered. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, flesh and blood. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stumbled forward, her arms wrapping around him in a fierce, desperate embrace. Michael held her tightly, his own sobs breaking through as he clung to his daughter, the years of separation dissolving in the flood of emotion. "I thought you were dead," Grace cried, her voice muffled against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "I'm so sorry," Michael whispered, his voice raw with regret. "I never should have left you." "I'm so sorry, Grace." Vivian stood a few steps away, her own tears flowing freely as she watched the reunion unfold. It was a moment she had never thought possible, a moment that defied all the pain and loss they had endured. As father and daughter held each other, the room seemed to fill with the weight of everything they had been through. Years of hiding, of fear, of loss. But now there was hope. Now there was the chance to rebuild what had been broken. Vivian wiped her tears, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The storm was over. They had survived. And now, finally, they could begin again. For the first time in a long time, Vivian allowed herself to believe in a future that wasn't defined by fear or betrayal. A future where Grace could have her family back, where the truth had been brought into the light, and where justice had prevailed. And as the night deepened around them, the mansion no longer felt like a place of shadows. It felt like a home,